Mental illness is often a subjective feeling that the things aren't right in terms of their emotions or even in terms of one's thinking. So it may be, in essence, a measure of well-being, but often the determinant of whether it's an illness or disorder rests on whether it's affecting function. So if a person's function is affected by their mood or the anxiety, then that is a problem and an illness and a disorder that may need to be addressed.
I found that the Canadian Mental Health Association, they made a statement which I found very helpful for me. They said, if you have a brain, you can have mental illness. And that clarifies it more for me because I see it as brain illness. And it's the brain that governs our thought patterns, our perceptions, our moods, even our behavior. And if the brain malfunctions, then there's going to be problems in those other areas. And there can be a number of reasons why the brain may malfunction. It may be stress that will cause the brain to malfunction to a certain extent. It may be chemical imbalances. It may be even an injury to the brain. And we know that when the brain is injured, maybe from an accident, it may result in radical behavior changes. If the brain is malfunctioning, then we may have distorted perceptions. Our behavior may be very abnormal and maybe scary to some people. We may lose touch with reality. And that really helped me in terms of understanding what it is. And it can have many, many reasons for it, many causes that would cause the brain to malfunction.
Definitely there seems to be a genetic component with many illnesses, including anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and even schizophrenia. There may be even a relation in terms of addictions around alcohol. I think the other thing that really plays a big role is the environment that a person lives in and how that influences their worldview, their self-worth, their sense of outlook, and how that all pertains to well-being and the way they feel about themselves. There is something called the stress diathesis model, which basically talks about, given any particular stress with any particular individual, we all have a risk at a particular zone, whatever the stressors might be, to possibly develop a mental health problem. So if children are exposed to abuse or trauma, I think what it does is create what I call sort of the Randy Gosling elastic band theory. Basically what happens is most of us face the world with tensions and stress by stretching and the rubber band basically comes back to order. But people who have been at war or have been traumatized may have had their elastic band, if I can say, stretched so far beyond what is sort of most of us have ever faced. So in light of that, I think what happens, there is risk towards anxiety aspects, particularly panic disorder. There's issues around mood components that are associated with this. I think there can be aspects of, as I mentioned, hypervigilance and control, whether it's obsessive compulsive tendencies. And I think the other, more important thing is it really can affect trust and relationship. And that could be anything from, can I trust friends? Can I trust my spouse? Can I trust God? And how does that impact their life in the future? We know that people who are drinking heavily may actually have very similar symptoms as those who have major depression. The difference is that once they stop drinking, often those mood components go away. So it's clear that substances can impact on a person's mood, it can impact on their sleep patterns, and all these factors that affect a person emotionally. As mentioned before, there may be some connection with certain substances and the development of certain disorders, and I believe some recent literature has shown possibly a connection between marijuana and schizophrenia. Sometimes you wonder whether people are actually self-medicating to manage their anxiety disorders, and clearly many times we've seen people say, hey, I'm myself, I'm relaxed, I can finally meet with people if I drink before I go out and deal with the stress of social interactions.
And so probably, yes, there was probably a depression that he disguised rather well, which many people do. There's a lot of depressed people around that we will never see, that we don't know. They hide it real well. So I think, yeah, there was probably some depression issues, and that maybe led to the feelings of being so overwhelmed and so on, where if he hadn't been depressed, it wouldn't have seemed that great. Where he was depressed, and probably was, he probably just felt he couldn't handle it. And everybody would be better off if he wasn't around, because then we wouldn't have to worry about him, sort of thing. It's a very distorted perception, but it was probably there.
Well, when mental illness enters into the family, and because of the stigma and the shame that's out there, they just don't want it to be happening in their family. I mean, with most illnesses, we just say this can't be, a sense of denial, that type of thing. But especially with mental illnesses, to get a diagnosis of mental illness, it shakes the family up. It challenges the whole family system. Families need to understand what mental illnesses are and aren't. They need to understand effective treatments from a very holistic point of view, and not just betting that the medication is going to cover all the grounds, but they need to know about that. Families need psychoeducation, or education in general, in terms of how to help their loved one, because how they help can hinder or truly help them. So it's not to become a caretaker, because the only thing that needs a caretaker is a cemetery, but how to be an effective caregiver. Family members also need to understand the mental health system. Where do I go to get help? How do I get the system to work for me? There's such waiting lists, long waiting lists, and shortages of practitioners that it's not uncommon for people to have to wait a year, at least in Toronto, up to a year to see a psychiatrist. In Winnipeg, it can take 3 to 5 months just to see a community mental health worker. But my concern is being able to have access to practitioners that take a very holistic approach to mental health care, not just biomedical, not just spiritual, but the very holistic biopsychosocial spiritual recovery perspective.
My wife Peg, her family has suffered to a certain extent from bipolar disorder. Although with Peg, it's been mostly the depression side, and she struggled with it for years, and it's been difficult for us at times. My daughter Jacqueline has suffered from some depression as well, and to a certain extent some anxiety disorder, and so there's been some of that within our family, and we've dealt with it in a number of ways. We've dealt with it at the medical level, where Peg has been on medication, and so has Jacqueline to a certain extent. That has really helped. We've had some therapy intervention, especially for Jacqueline. She's had some therapy which has really helped. Some counselors that have just listened to her and helped her work through some things. We've had prayer. There's been a lot of prayer involved in this, in terms of God giving us the strength, giving us the wisdom, giving us discretion to know what to do, and so on, giving us that strength within ourselves that comes from Him. And there's also been some environmental and lifestyle changes. For example, one of the reasons why I retired a few years early, one of the reasons was so that we could change our environment for part of the winter, because it seemed that was so therapeutic for Peg, to get out of these dark, cold days and get down where the climate was a little warmer, where there was more sun, and where we could get out more, and made a remarkable difference.